The pianist laughed at Bumpy Johnson in a crowded Harlem club, daring him to sing, expecting fists and blood because men who mock kings usually learn what silence costs. Harlem breathed low and slow that night, smoke hanging heavy beneath yellowed lights, the kind that softened faces and sharpened judgments. The club was crowded, not loud yet, just alive enough to feel watched. Every table leaned inward, as if the room itself listened. Bumpy Johnson sat without announcing himself, coat buttoned, hat angled just enough to shadow his eyes. He did not drink fast. He did not speak first. Men like him never did. His presence pressed down on the floorboards, subtle but undeniable, like weight added to a scale long before it tips. Music rolled across the room, piano notes sliding easy, confident, almost playful. The pianist was good. Too good to be careless. Too proud to stay quiet. He played to be seen, not just heard. Fingers moved fast, showy, pulling smiles from strangers who didn't know the rules of the room. Each note carried confidence, but not wisdom. The crowd nodded along, tapping glasses, letting the night convince them it was safe. Harlem could feel gentle when it wanted. That illusion never lasted long. Bumpy watched without expression, eyes steady, shoulders relaxed. He knew music. Not the notes, not the scales, but the power behind it. Music was control, timing, knowing when to fill the silence and when to let it swallow a man whole. He had learned that on streets where voices mattered less than pauses, where saying nothing could end arguments before they began. The pianist mistook stillness for absence. That mistake had ended men before. The laugh came suddenly, sharp, cutting. It didn't belong to the room, didn't rise naturally with the rhythm. It broke the music's back. The pianist leaned forward on his bench, eyes flicking toward Bumpy like a challenge disguised as humor. He said it light, tossed it into the air like a harmless joke, told Bumpy he should try singing sometime, sighed, "It's smiling," said it loud enough for the tables closest to hear, loud enough for silence to notice. The club froze. Not instantly. It slowed first, like a heartbeat skipping before stopping. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. A woman near the bar turned her head, then didn't move again. The piano keys stayed. Pressed, sound lingering too long, wrong now. Everyone understood what that laugh meant. It wasn't comedy. It was permission. Permission for violence. Permission for blood. That was how things usually went when someone mocked a king in public. Bumpy did nothing. No flinch. No tightening of the jaw. He didn't lift his eyes right away. He finished his breath first, calm as prayer. Men around him shifted, instinctively, creating space like animals sensing weather change. Nobody reached for a weapon. Nobody needed to. The expectation alone was enough to make the room sweat. This was the moment stories usually started with. The moment mothers warned sons about. The moment men exaggerated later when retelling it to feel braver than they were. The pianist's smile thinned. He hadn't expected silence. He had expected movement. A step forward. A chair scraping back. Violence followed by legend. Instead, he got nothing. Just Bumpy Johnson sitting still, hands resting easy, face unreadable. That was worse. Silence gave the insult time to rot in the open. Time for everyone to consider who had spoken and who had been spoken to. Time for consequences to choose their shape. Bumpy finally looked up, slow, deliberate. His eyes carried no anger, just acknowledgement, as if he'd heard a clock chime, as if something scheduled had arrived on time. He studied the pianist the way a landlord studies a tenant who's missed rent too many times. No rush, no heat. The kind of look that stripped bravado down to bone. The pianist shifted again, laughing softer now, unsure where to put his hands. Around them, Harlem held its breath. This wasn't about music anymore. It wasn't about a joke. It was about order. About whether respect still meant something when temptation whispered louder than sense. Everyone in that room belonged to Bumpy in one way or another: protection, employment, silence, survival. The insult hadn't just challenged a man. It had tested the structure holding the neighborhood upright. Bumpy leaned back slightly, adjusting his coat with care. The smallest movement, but it carried weight. It told the room this would be handled. Not loudly, not quickly. Handled properly. The pianist swallowed, finally understanding the danger he'd invited. The crowd waited, eyes darting between the bench and the shadowed table. Violence hovered close enough to taste. But Bumpy Johnson remained calm. And in Harlem, calm was never the absence of power. It was proof of it. Harlem did not need introductions. It recognized Bumpy Johnson the way a church recognizes its bell: by sound, by timing, by the way everything else moved around it. Even seated, even silent, he organized the room without effort. The bartender poured slower. The doorman stopped watching the door. Conversations thinned out, then disappeared. Respect in Harlem wasn't demanded. It was practiced. Learned young. Remembered always. This neighborhood had seen loud men come and go. Men who shouted their names, flashed money, bled out in alleys before their reputations could settle. Bumpy was different. He had survived long enough to become part of the streets themselves. His authority didn't spike. It endured. He paid debts others forgot. He protected families nobody else noticed. When he spoke, it was measured. When he stayed quiet, it meant something was already decided. The pianist had grown up nearby, close enough to know the stories, far enough to think talent made him exempt. Music had carried him above the corners, above the rules, or so he believed. On stage, applause felt like armor. It made him careless. In Harlem, carelessness was expensive. The people at the tables understood that better than he did. They weren't impressed by skill alone. They watched how a man behaved when power sat in the room with him. Bumpy's eyes drifted across the club, not settling on the pianist yet. He looked at faces instead. Old men who remembered when the streets were meaner. Women who knew which blocks were safe because he said so. Young runners who learned early that protection came with expectations. Each look was a reminder. This moment didn't belong to the pianist anymore. It belonged to Harlem. And Harlem answered to Bumpy. The insult lingered in the air, sour now. Nobody laughed again. The joke had died where it landed. The pianist felt it slipping away from him, control draining out through his fingers. He tried to recover, playing a few notes, softer this time. The sound didn't help. It only made the silence heavier. Music couldn't smooth this over. Respect wasn't something you played your way back into. Bumpy leaned forward just enough to be noticed. Chairs creaked. A man near the bar straightened his jacket without realizing why. Authority moved through the room like a current, unseen, but felt. Bumpy spoke quietly to the man beside him, a single sentence, low and calm. The words themselves didn't matter. The act did. It signaled intention, not rage, not forgiveness. Intention. The pianist's hands trembled now. He felt smaller on that bench, the spotlight harsher than before. He had expected a response shaped like violence because that was easy to understand. Violence was simple. It ended things. What he faced instead was patience. And patience in Harlem was dangerous. It meant the lesson would last longer than bruises. It meant witnesses would remember. Bumpy finally addressed him, voice even, unraised. He didn't repeat the joke, didn't scold, didn't threaten. He asked a question instead. Simple, polite. It landed harder than any slap. Questions demanded answers, and answers revealed character. The pianist hesitated, mouth opening, closing again. The room waited. This wasn't a confrontation anymore. It was an examination. Around them, the community leaned in not physically, but emotionally. They understood what was being taught. Power didn't rush. It allowed mistakes to expose themselves fully. Bumpy wasn't defending his pride. He was defending the order that kept Harlem from tearing itself apart. Public disrespect, if left unchecked, spread fast. Tonight, it would be corrected. Not violently. Permanently. The pianist tried to laugh again. It sounded wrong this time, thin and brittle. Nobody joined him. Applause didn't come. The music was finished whether he admitted it or not. Bumpy watched him struggle, not with satisfaction, but with resolve. This was necessary for the boy on the bench, for the people watching, for the future that depended on knowing where the lines were drawn. Bumpy stood, slowly. The room adjusted instantly, bodies shifting to give him space. He didn't loom. He didn't invade. He simply existed at full height, and that was enough. Harlem had seen this posture before. It meant things were about to change shape. Not explode, settle. He nodded once toward the pianist. Not in anger, in acknowledgement. A signal that the moment would continue, but on Bumpy's terms. The club waited, suspended between what it expected and what it was about to witness. Outside, Harlem kept breathing, unaware it was about to gain. Another story it would tell quietly for years. The spotlight that once felt warm now pressed down on the pianist like judgment. It wasn't brighter. It wasn't hotter. It was simply honest. Every face in the club watched him without blinking, not curious anymore, not entertained. This was no longer a performance space. It had become a courtroom, and the verdict depended on how long a man could stand inside his own mistake. Bumpy Johnson did not rush him. He returned to his seat instead of advancing, an unexpected move that unsettled the room. Men with lesser authority stepped forward to be feared. Bumpy stepped back to be obeyed. That choice alone shifted the balance. The pianist had hoped the tension would snap, hoped anger would release him from responsibility. Instead, the moment stretched. Time thickened. Silence worked like a slow blade. The piano keys sat untouched. They looked foreign now, like tools belonging to someone else. The pianist flexed his fingers, trying to remember who he'd been before the joke, before the laugh, before the room changed shape around him. He glanced toward the exit, then quickly. Away. Leaving wasn't an option. Not like this. Not with Bumpy watching. Departure without permission was its own insult. Bumpy studied him carefully, not as an enemy, but as a variable. He had seen this pattern before. Talented men mistaking. Applause for immunity. Thinking skill excused arrogance. Thinking the room belonged to them because it listened. Harlem didn't reward that kind of thinking. Harlem rewarded restraint. Bumpy had built his power on knowing when to hold back, when to let others reveal themselves fully before acting. The pianist cleared his throat and tried to speak. His voice cracked on the first word. That alone told the room everything it needed to know. Confidence was gone. What remained was survival instinct, raw and clumsy. He offered a half apology, poorly shaped, tangled in excuses. He said he was joking, said he meant no harm, said music was about freedom. Each sentence made things worse. Bumpy raised a hand, not sharply, not aggressively, just enough. The pianist stopped immediately. That was the first lesson. Authority. Didn't shout. It didn't need to. When Bumpy lifted a hand, men listened because they understood consequences lived behind that gesture, quiet and permanent. The room exhaled together, relieved to have direction again. You're talented. Bumpy said calmly. Not praise, not condemnation. A fact stated plainly. The pianist nodded too quickly, grateful for anything that sounded like mercy. But mercy wasn't what was happening here. Bumpy continued, voice steady, measured. He spoke about respect without naming it, about knowing where you stood, about understanding the weight of a room before trying to move it. The words weren't long. They didn't need to be. Each one landed clean, unadorned. Bumpy wasn't lecturing. He was outlining reality, Harlem reality, a place where talent earned opportunity, but humility earned survival, where jokes had consequences because words shaped order. The pianist listened, eyes fixed now, finally understanding that this wasn't about punishment. It was about correction. Pressure built again, but different now. Not the pressure of imminent violence. The pressure of expectation. Bumpy turned the focus back to the pianist, offering him something dangerous choice. Not spoken as such, but implied. Continue badly or recover properly. The room leaned forward, sensing the shift. This was the hinge. This was where a man either learned or broke. The pianist swallowed hard. He looked down at the keys, then up at Bumpy. For the first time, he saw him clearly, not as a threat, not as a legend, but as a force that didn't need to prove itself. The pianist nodded once slowly. He apologized again, this time without humor, without defense, just acknowledgement. It wasn't perfect. It didn't erase the insult, but it showed understanding. Bumpy accepted it with a simple inclination of the head, not forgiveness, recognition. The room absorbed that distinction. Apologies didn't wipe away mistakes. They marked the beginning of accountability. Bumpy gestured gently toward the piano. An invitation, not a command. The message was clear. Continue, but do it right. The pianist sat straighter, hands steadier now. He began to play again, softly at first, not showy, not fast. He let the notes breathe, letting space do some of the work. The crowd listened differently now. They weren't just hearing music. They were witnessing adjustment, growth under pressure. Survival earned in real time. Bumpy listened too, eyes half-lidded, posture relaxed. This was the outcome he preferred. Violence ended stories. Lessons extended them. Harlem didn't need another tale of blood on the floor. It needed reminders of order, of who protected it and how. This moment would travel farther than a fight ever could. The pianist found his rhythm again, but it was humbler now. The arrogance was gone, replaced by respect shaped through fear and relief. He played as if the room mattered, as if the people mattered, because now he understood they did. Every note carried that awareness. The club softened slightly, tension easing, though never fully gone. It didn't need to be. Bumpy rose once more quietly this time, slipping on his coat. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't look back. His role in the moment was finished. The correction had been delivered. The order restored. Men stepped aside as he moved toward the door, instinctively clearing his path. Respect moved faster. Then he did dot as he exited. The pianist kept playing, hand steady, heart still racing. He knew this night would follow him forever, not as a triumph, as a turning point. Harlem would remember it not as the night someone challenged Bumpy Johnson, but as the night Bumpy Johnson reminded everyone why challenges ended before they began. Outside, the street hummed softly, unaware of the lesson just sealed inside the club. Bumpy paused briefly, breathing in the city he protected without asking credit. Then he walked on, calm as ever, leaving behind silence, music, and a room that would never forget how power truly sounded. The music carried on after Bumpy. Johnson left, but it no longer belonged to the pianist. It belonged to the room. Every note echoed with what had almost happened and what had been deliberately avoided. Harlem understood that difference. Violence announced weakness. Control announced permanence. Tonight, Control had one dot inside the tick that's inside the club. People sat differently now, shoulders lowered. Voices returned carefully, as if the walls themselves were listening. No one spoke Bumpy's name out loud. They didn't need to. His presence lingered, not like a ghost, but like law. The kind you followed even when the judge had already left the building. The pianist played through the set without flair. No bravado. No jokes. Each song was measured, respectful, restrained. He had learned that skill alone didn't grant permission. It granted responsibility. Every glance he cast toward the tables carried humility now. He knew he had been spared, not excused. Harlem had given him a warning dressed as mercy. Men near the bar exchanged brief looks. Not approval. Confirmation. The order still held. That mattered more than entertainment. In this neighborhood, stability was currency. Bumpy Johnson had protected it again without spilling blood, and that fact would travel faster than any rumor of violence ever could. Outside, word began moving before the night was over. Not loudly, not exaggerated. Just facts passed carefully from mouth to mouth. A pianist had laughed. Bumpy Johnson had listened. Harlem had watched. The ending surprised everyone who didn't understand power. Those who did nodded quietly and went on with their lives. Public disrespect had been answered with private control. That was the lesson. Bumpy hadn't needed to humiliate the man. Humiliation faded. Memory didn't. The pianist would carry this moment into every room he ever played again. He would remember how quickly applause turned into silence, how fragile confidence became when confronted by calm authority. Bumpy walked the streets with the same unhurried pace he always kept. Men tipped hats. Women nodded. Nobody stopped him. Respect didn't interrupt. It accompanied. He didn't replay the incident in his mind. He didn't savor it. That wasn't how he operated. Moments like that were maintenance, not pleasure. Necessary work to keep the machine from tearing itself apart. He thought about Harlem as a whole, not the club, not the joke. He thought about what happened when people forgot where they stood. Disorder crept in quietly, disguised as humor, ambition, talent. If left unchecked, it grew teeth. Bumpy had seen it too many times to ignore it now. Tonight had been small. That was the point. Back inside, the pianist finished his final song to polite applause. Not thunderous, not cruel. Appropriate. He stepped away from the bench with a slight bow, hands damp, legs unsteady. He knew he had survived something bigger than embarrassment. He had survived a test of character in front of the one man whose judgment mattered most. As people filtered out, a few offered him quiet nods. Not congratulations. Acknowledgement. You learned. That was enough. In Harlem, learning kept you alive longer than talent ever could. The pianist packed his things carefully, avoiding the mirror behind the bar. He didn't want to see his own face yet. He already knew it had changed. The bartender wiped down the counter slowly, methodically. He had seen nights end in screams. He preferred nights like this. Nights where the lesson stayed clean, where no one had to explain bloodstains to the morning light. He poured himself a drink after closing and raised it slightly toward the empty space where Bumpy had sat. Respect didn't require witnesses. By the time dawn approached, the story had settled into its final shape. No embellishments. No heroics. Just a reminder. Don't confuse silence for weakness. Don't mistake patience for permission. And never forget that Harlem protected itself through men who understood restraint better than rage. Bumpy reached home without incident. He removed his coat, placed his hat down carefully, and sat for a moment before turning out the light. Another night passed. Another correction made. His legacy wasn't built on explosions. It was built on moments like this, quiet, controlled, inevitable. Somewhere across the city, A pianist lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every second. He would never laugh the same way again. Harlem had taken something from him that night. Not his talent, his arrogance. And in return, it had given him something far more valuable. Understanding. The room waited. Every eye fixed on the pianist, every ear attuned to the faintest sound. The tension was no longer in the joke, no longer in the insult. It hovered in the space between expectation and reality. Bumpy Johnson had left once, but his absence carried more weight than his presence ever could. The club had learned to breathe according to his rhythm. Now it held its breath. The pianist's hands hovered over the keys, uncertain, trembling just enough for the crowd to feel it. He wanted to fill the silence, wanted to assert control through noise, but it would not come. Not tonight. Not in Bumpy's room. In Harlem, the lesson came not with fists or threats, but with presence, with inevitability, with eyes that measured consequence before sound. He pressed the first key. The note quivered. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't fast. It was deliberate. And through that single note, the room felt the shift. They had anticipated chaos. They had anticipated punishment. What they did not anticipate was authority exercised so completely, so silently, it bent the night itself to order. Bumpy returned, not with urgency, not with force, but with the kind of calm that makes men reconsider every impulse they've ever had. He stood in the back of the room, coat buttoned, hat tilted just so. No gesture, no word, just presence. And presence in Harlem, when it belonged to him, was a force heavier than any weapon. The pianist began again, this time letting the music fill the room as it should. Not for applause, not for vanity, for respect, for understanding. Each note became a statement, each chord a confession. He realized, perhaps too late, that he was no longer playing to impress. He was playing to survive. And the survival required him to acknowledge authority he had mocked moments before. Bumpy's eyes swept the crowd. Patrons stiffened, shifted, recalculated their loyalties. He did not speak, and yet his judgment fell over every table. Men who had been ready to speak, to intervene, to challenge, they waited. Women who had glanced nervously at the exit now exhaled in relief. The lesson was being delivered silently, and yet it hit harder than any shout could. The pianist faltered once, missing a chord, and the room winced. The music did not stop, however. He did not stop. Bumpy's presence was the lever that kept the moment steady, a reminder that authority did not need perfection to command obedience. The audience understood instinctively. Mistakes could be absorbed under control. Recklessness could not. A woman at the bar murmured a prayer softly, unnoticed by most, but Bumpy heard it. Not because he was searching, but because the room was attuned to him. Every whisper, every gesture, every heartbeat belonged to his rhythm. Harlem was alive, and the city itself was taking note. No one needed to shout, no one needed to act. The lesson had been built into the silence, into the watchful restraint that marked him. The pianist's final song approached. He played with a measured hand, humility shaping each note. He allowed space between chords, letting silence speak where arrogance had spoken before. The lesson was clear. Authority doesn't demand noise. It demands patience. It demands recognition. And most of all, it demands understanding from those who think themselves clever enough to defy it. Bumpy stepped forward then, slowly, deliberately, not to touch, not to threaten, simply to exist within the moment he had created. The crowd recoiled, subtly, not from fear of him, but from recognition that the room had shifted permanently. This was his stage now, not because he took it, but because he allowed the lesson to land with precision. The pianist played the last note softly, letting them fade into the room like mist. The club held on to them, not applauding too soon, not moving too quickly. Even after the music ended, the silence remained thick, heavy, instructive. Everyone understood what had just occurred. This wasn't performance. This wasn't entertainment. This was mastery. Authority exercised so completely that no one could argue against it. Bumpy Johnson didn't move immediately. He watched the pianist bow, slow, deliberate, acknowledgement given without humiliation. The man had survived. But more importantly, he had learned. That was the victory. Not a fist, not a shout, but a lesson etched into the hearts of everyone present. Power through restraint. Respect maintained without chaos. The inevitability of authority fully realized, he finally turned, walking toward the door, coat brushing along the floorboards. Silence followed him, unbroken. It didn't lift. It lingered, a reminder of what had been seen, what had been learned. The room exhaled only after he had stepped outside. The night remained calm, but the impact would last years. This was not spectacle. This was legacy. Harlem whispered quietly in the streets outside. Patrons left with heads held higher, not from pride, but from understanding. Stories would travel from block to block, retold with care, stripped of exaggeration, yet never losing the weight of truth. Bumpy Johnson had acted once more not as a man, but as the measure of his city. The piano's final notes faded into memory. The lesson would not dot, and in that stillness, everyone realized that the joke had ended. Not with violence, not with blood, but with something far more dangerous to arrogance, control. And control, wielded with patience, was eternal. By the time the last patron slipped out of the club, the night had already rewritten itself. The smoke hung in the corners like a soft memory, curling in lazy tendrils around tables that had held witnesses. Chairs were pushed back carefully, glasses wiped clean, but the weight of what had happened lingered heavier than anything tangible. Bumpy Johnson was gone, but his presence still ruled the room. The silence he left behind carried authority, a quiet proof of power that needed no demonstration. The pianist remained seated for a moment longer, hands resting lightly on the keys, eyes unfocused. He wasn't thinking about applause or recognition anymore. Those were gone, irrelevant. Instead, he thought of restraint. He thought of patience. He thought of authority so complete that it didn't have to shout. And he understood, finally, that survival wasn't about talent or bravado or daring jokes. It was about knowing the boundaries of the world you inhabited and respecting the men who drew them. Outside, Harlem breathed in rhythm with itself. Streets hummed softly under the amber glow of lampposts. Shopkeepers swept their sidewalks. Mothers called children inside. The city felt ordinary, but beneath that surface, something had shifted. News would travel, careful and true, from neighbor to neighbor. Bumpy was there. He didn't hit him. He didn't have to. The lesson was enough. People would tell it quietly, like a prayer, because Harlem never needed the legend inflated. The lesson alone was heavier than myth. Bumpy walked home slowly, each step measured. He did not boast. He did not replay the night in his mind. That wasn't how he measured success. Moments like this weren't trophies. They were maintenance. They were reminders that order required attention, that respect had to be enforced softly and without spectacle, and that power meant knowing when to act and when to simply exist. He paused once to look down a quiet street, hands in pockets, coat turned neatly over his shoulder. Harlem had survived another night because of him. That was enough. The story would grow carefully over time. Children would hear it as warning. Adults would hear it as instruction. Musicians and shopkeepers, old men and young runners, would all carry the memory of a single night where a joke almost broke the rules and a man restored them without raising a fist. Respect had been taught, community had been protected, and legacy had been quietly reinforced. These were the truths that lasted, not headlines, not spectacle, not fleeting heroism. Just endurance, quiet and deliberate. By dawn, the city was still. Asleep, unaware that the night had changed its rhythm. The pianist would leave the club with a different understanding of himself. Harlem would tell the story without exaggeration, trimming nothing that mattered. And Bumpy Johnson would rise again tomorrow, walking his streets in silence, calm as ever, authority unbroken. He never needed to shout. He never needed to fight. He only needed to exist, and the world would follow the course he laid out. And that was how Harlem remembered him, not for the violence he avoided, but for the quiet mastery with which he commanded a room, a neighborhood, and ultimately a legacy that no one could ever rewrite.